The boarding begins. The airport was buzzing with travelers eager to reach their destinations. Among them was James, a tall black man dressed in his crisp military uniform. He had a quiet, strong presence, with a few signs of weariness from his recent deployment. James was on his way home, finally getting a chance to relax and see his family after several challenging months. As he walked toward the boarding gate for his flight, he held a first-class ticket in hand. It was a small reward he had saved up for, a comfortable seat in first class. This seat meant more to him than just comfort. It was a little piece of normalcy, a break from the hard days he'd spent serving his country. The gate agent called for first-class boarding, and James stepped forward, joining a small line of well-dressed passengers. As he approached, he noticed a few glances his way. He wasn't surprised. In his uniform, he often drew attention. Most of the looks were admiring, nods of respect from those who recognized his service. But one person in the line, a woman named Lisa, looked at him differently. Lisa was impeccably dressed in a designer outfit, her hair and makeup perfectly done. She had a confident, almost entitled look as she held her expensive handbag close. When her eyes landed on James, her expression shifted to one of discomfort, as though she couldn't believe he would be joining her in first class. James felt her stare but tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the flight ahead. He was looking forward to a quiet seat by the window and perhaps a nap to recharge. But Lisa's gaze stayed fixed on him, a slight frown on her face, as though she was questioning his place in line. As the line moved forward, passengers handed their tickets to the gate agent and boarded. When it was James's turn, the agent smiled warmly at him. "Thank you for your service," she said quietly as she scanned his ticket. James nodded politely, appreciating the kind gesture, and made his way down the jet bridge to the plane. Stepping onto the aircraft, James was directed to his first-class seat by a friendly flight attendant. He took a moment to appreciate the wide, comfortable seats and the peaceful atmosphere. He placed his duffel bag in the overhead compartment and took his seat by the window, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The familiar hum of the plane was a welcome sound. Soon, he'd be thousands of feet in the air, leaving all worries on the ground below. Just as he settled in, Lisa appeared in the aisle. Her eyes scanned the row, and when they landed on James, her expression changed from surprise to something bordering on irritation. She hesitated for a moment, as if reconsidering her seating choice. Then, with a barely audible sigh, she sat down in the seat next to him, visibly uncomfortable. A few seconds later, Lisa leaned toward him slightly, her voice quiet but sharp. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked, her tone implying she doubted it. James turned to her, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Yes, this is my seat," he replied simply, showing her his boarding pass as proof. Lisa's eyes scanned the boarding pass, and a hint of disbelief flickered in her gaze. "Oh, I see. I just thought." "Well, never mind," she said, her tone cold. She quickly looked away, her face reflecting a mix of annoyance and discomfort. James decided not to react. He had encountered situations like this before, where people assumed things about him based on appearance. Instead of letting it bother him, he chose to focus on his own journey, his thoughts drifting back to home, where his family awaited him. The other passengers began filling in, and soon, the first-class section was nearly full. A few people exchanged polite smiles and nods with James as they walked by, but Lisa kept her eyes forward, avoiding any interaction with him. She adjusted her seatbelt with a huff, as if even sharing a row with him was somehow bothersome. The cabin crew made announcements, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for takeoff. The flight attendant assigned to first class came by, offering drinks and small snacks before departure. She paused at James's row, giving him a respectful smile. "Thank you for your service," she said softly, handing him a drink. "Thank you," James replied, his voice warm and appreciative. He could feel a sense of calm settling over him, the respectful gestures of the crew helping ease any discomfort from the earlier interaction. Lisa watched this exchange out of the corner of her eye, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she turned back, crossing her arms and looking straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the kind words James had just received. Her demeanor suggested she felt that her first-class experience was being somehow disturbed. As the plane began to taxi, James leaned back in his seat, eager to leave this brief tension behind. But he couldn't help but wonder why, even now, people like Lisa still held on to judgments and assumptions. He chose to focus instead on the positives, the journey ahead, and the warm welcome he'd receive at home. What James didn't know, however, was that someone else had been observing the entire interaction with interest. Sitting just a few rows behind, a distinguished older man had been watching the exchange quietly. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in Lisa's behavior and James's calm response. This older gentleman's expression was one of quiet disapproval and a hint of curiosity. The plane took off smoothly, and James closed his eyes, hoping for a peaceful flight. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he sensed that this journey would be more eventful than he had expected. Little did he know, this flight would leave everyone with a memory they wouldn't soon forget. Tension in the air. As the plane reached its cruising altitude, James remained quiet, his gaze fixed on the view outside the window. The clouds stretched out below, and he felt a sense of calm, momentarily distancing himself from the awkwardness beside him. But Lisa's tension was impossible to ignore. She sighed heavily, glancing around the first-class cabin as if searching for someone she felt would be a more appropriate seatmate. Her eyes darted back to James now and then, each time with a subtle look of irritation, as if she hoped he'd suddenly decide to leave or switch seats. But James, who had seen his share of adversity, sat calmly, his expression unchanged. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned to offer in-flight services. "Would you like anything to drink or a snack?" she asked, addressing James first with a warm smile. "Just water, please," James replied, his voice courteous. Lisa, however, interjected before the flight attendant could hand over the drink. "Excuse me," she said, leaning forward slightly. "Are you sure he should be sitting here?" The flight attendant blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Is there a problem?" Lisa forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I wasn't expecting someone like him to be in first class," she said, her voice low but filled with implication. The attendant's smile dropped, replaced by a calm professionalism. "This gentleman has a valid first-class ticket, ma'am," she said firmly. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" Lisa glanced at James, her cheeks slightly flushed as she sensed a few eyes in the nearby rows turning their way. "No, thank you," she muttered, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. After the flight attendant left, an uncomfortable silence settled between James and Lisa. James chose not to react, silently reminding himself to stay calm and patient. He took a sip of water, blocking out her attitude and trying to focus on his journey ahead. He could feel Lisa's glances, but kept his eyes on the view outside. Behind them, however, the older man who had noticed the earlier interaction was watching closely. This gentleman, who appeared to be in his 60s and carried an air of quiet authority, seemed increasingly bothered by what he had just witnessed. His brow furrowed slightly as he observed Lisa's subtle but pointed behavior toward James. Lisa was oblivious to the man's watchful eyes and seemed determined to ignore James, occasionally adjusting her seat or tapping her fingers in mild frustration. After a few minutes, she took out her phone, snapping a few selfies and adjusting her hair, appearing more focused on herself than anything else around her. Just then, the flight attendant returned with complimentary headphones and a blanket for each first-class passenger. As she handed the items to James, she leaned down and quietly said, "Thank you again for your service." Her genuine tone carried a warmth that contrasted starkly with Lisa's earlier behavior. James nodded in appreciation, smiling softly. Lisa's expression turned stony, and she shifted in her seat, looking out into the aisle, clearly unimpressed by the attention he received. Throughout the flight, small moments of tension lingered, with Lisa's pointed sighs and annoyed glances adding to the uncomfortable air around them. But James remained calm, keeping his focus on his own space and the long-awaited rest he hoped to get. Still, he felt the tension from his seatmate and sensed that something more was brewing. Little did Lisa realize that her words and actions had not gone unnoticed. The quiet gentleman a few rows back, still watching, seemed to be waiting for the right moment. A subtle confrontation. As the flight continued, Lisa's impatience grew. She adjusted her seat, scrolled through her phone, and occasionally threw James a glance filled with irritation. It seemed like no amount of distance between them in that spacious first-class cabin could ease her discomfort. The older gentleman seated a few rows back had taken quiet notice of the tension. Dressed in a simple yet dignified manner, he was a calm, observant figure, someone who noticed details others might overlook. Every time Lisa glanced James's way with that subtle disdain, the older man seemed to grow more alert. His brow furrowed slightly, as if contemplating a thought he hadn't fully formed yet. Soon, the flight attendants returned to offer dinner service. James kindly declined, saying he wasn't very hungry, and asked for just a bit of coffee. Lisa, on the other hand, ordered a full meal, seemingly trying to distract herself from her discomfort by focusing on the luxurious meal. As the attendants left, Lisa couldn't hold back any longer. She cleared her throat and turned to James. "So, do you fly first class often?" she asked, her tone layered with disbelief. James glanced at her, recognizing the question for what it was. "Not often," he answered simply, "but I earned enough miles to upgrade this time." "Oh." Lisa's eyebrows rose, and she gave him a tight smile. "I see. Frequent flyer miles." Her response was dismissive, as if she'd heard what she wanted to hear, and it confirmed her assumptions. James remained calm, offering no additional details. He was well-versed in handling moments like these, trained by both life and his career to maintain his composure. Lisa's assumptions, her tone, and her attitude all bounced off him, his self-assured demeanor unshaken. But behind them, the older gentleman was not as composed. He had witnessed enough of this behavior, and a flicker of irritation crossed his face. Leaning forward, he made his first subtle move. He stood, stretched a bit, and walked slowly up the aisle, taking a moment to pass by Lisa and James's row, his eyes assessing the scene more closely. He didn't speak, but his expression conveyed silent disapproval. A few minutes later, the gentleman returned to his seat. This time, he didn't sit back passively. Instead, he leaned over to the flight attendant, who was now stationed nearby, and spoke softly. Though his words were inaudible to the rest of the cabin, the attendant nodded and looked over in the direction of James and Lisa. Back in her seat, Lisa was oblivious to the quiet exchange behind her. She continued to scroll through her phone, occasionally sighing as she peeked over at James, unable to comprehend why he was here in first class. As the flight attendant finished her quiet conversation, she made her way over to James. "Sir, thank you again for flying with us," she said kindly, glancing at the older gentleman who gave her an encouraging nod. Lisa's expression turned sour at the attendant's words of appreciation. Her gaze shifted from James to the flight attendant, a flicker of surprise crossing her face as she realized that others noticed James's presence in a way she hadn't anticipated. It was becoming clear that there was more to him than she initially assumed. James, however, remained gracious. He thanked the attendant, accepting her kind words without drawing attention. But the quiet tension in the air was growing, and Lisa was beginning to feel it. Just as she was about to say something dismissive, the older gentleman behind her leaned forward slightly, his calm voice carrying a hint of challenge as he directed a simple question at her. "Excuse me, miss," he began. "Is there a reason you seem uncomfortable with this gentleman here?" The unexpected question left Lisa momentarily speechless. Her face flushed as she stammered. "Oh, no. I mean, it's just surprising, that's all." The older man's gaze held steady, his calm eyes conveying a quiet authority. "Sometimes things aren't always as they appear. he said, his voice carrying a subtle note of warning that left Lisa feeling unsettled. James watched the exchange, grateful for the unexpected ally, but still choosing to remain composed. He took a sip of his coffee, aware that things were slowly shifting. The flight continued smoothly, but everyone could feel the slight undercurrent of tension, as if something more significant was building just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The tension rises. As the flight carried on, Lisa's unease was becoming palpable. The older man's words echoed in her mind, making her feel unexpectedly self-conscious. She stole glances at him, wondering who he was to make her feel this way. Meanwhile, James remained calm and composed, observing the subtle change in Lisa's demeanor, but keeping his thoughts to himself. A short while later, the flight attendant returned with dessert offerings. Lisa took one, more out of a need to distract herself than actual hunger. As she ate, she couldn't shake the feeling that the older man was still watching her, his eyes sharp and thoughtful. She shifted in her seat, trying to ignore the weight of his gaze, but the unease continued to gnaw at her. Finally, unable to take the silence any longer, Lisa leaned toward James, lowering her voice as if what she was about to say was a well-guarded secret. "So," she said, trying to sound casual, "you're in first class, but you don't really look like a frequent traveler." James looked at her with a calm expression, unfazed by her comment. "I've traveled plenty," he replied gently, "just usually not in first class." Lisa hesitated, then asked with a hint of skepticism, "Are you in the military?" James nodded. "Yes, I am. Army," he replied simply. Her expression softened slightly, as if finally beginning to recognize that he might be more than just a regular traveler. But instead of respecting his quiet pride, Lisa felt compelled to dig a bit deeper, curiosity tinged with suspicion. "Army, huh? So you're on leave?" James nodded again. "Coming home after a tour," he said, his voice steady but revealing nothing more. At this, the older gentleman behind them leaned forward again, his gaze keen as he listened to their conversation. He seemed both intrigued and mildly disappointed, sensing that Lisa was still blind to the significance of James's presence. A subtle silence followed, stretching out between Lisa and James as they both fell back into their own thoughts. But the tension had not gone unnoticed by the rest of the first-class cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering quietly to one another, aware that something unusual was unfolding. Moments later, the flight attendant came by, and James asked for a glass of water. As she handed it to him, she spoke with a warm smile. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said sincerely, and the words struck a chord with several other passengers who overheard. Lisa blinked, surprised by the comment. She looked around and noticed a few other passengers nodding respectfully toward James. The realization hit her then. James was not just another passenger. He was a soldier who had sacrificed much to protect others, and his presence here was a well-earned respite, not something to be questioned or dismissed. But before she could say anything, the older gentleman behind them spoke up, his tone calm yet carrying a hint of gravity. "It takes a certain strength to serve others selflessly," he said, his words directed at no one in particular, but clearly aimed toward Lisa. "Sometimes it's those who are overlooked who have done the most for us all." The cabin grew quiet as passengers took in his words. Lisa flushed, feeling the weight of their gazes upon her. She glanced at James, seeing him with new eyes, yet unsure of what to say or how to amend the assumptions she'd made. The flight attendant, sensing the shift, moved on quietly, leaving Lisa with her own thoughts. For the rest of the flight, she sat in silence, contemplating everything that had transpired, while James continued to sit calmly, aware of the silent yet powerful support of the passengers around him. As the journey went on, it became clear that this was more than a simple flight. Unseen by many, an important lesson was unfolding, a reminder of respect, of humility, and of gratitude for those who served without expectation of recognition. The stage was set for a revelation, one that would leave everyone, especially Lisa, forever changed. The revelation. As the plane neared its destination, Lisa felt a growing unease. The words of the older man lingered, and the quiet admiration from other passengers toward James weighed on her mind. She glanced at James once more, truly seeing him now for the first time. Gone was the stranger she'd initially judged. Instead, she saw a man who carried an unspoken strength, someone who had given much for the safety and freedom of others. Suddenly, the older gentleman leaned forward again, but this time he addressed James directly. "Young man," he said with a respectful nod, "you must have seen a lot during your time in the service. I just want you to know that many of us here appreciate what you've done for our country." James looked over, surprised but grateful. "Thank you, sir," he replied with humility. "I was just doing my duty, like any other soldier." The older man smiled and added, "I think most of us would agree that it's not just duty. It's a commitment that few have the courage to make." Hearing this, Lisa felt a pang of regret. She had initially dismissed James, seeing only his appearance and assuming he didn't belong in first class. But now, faced with the respect he was receiving, she realized how wrong she had been. Wanting to make amends, she turned to James with a small, tentative smile. "James," she started hesitantly, I didn't realize who you were. I didn't understand. I'm sorry if I was rude." James met her gaze, his expression kind but reserved. "It's okay," he said simply without any trace of resentment. "We all make judgments sometimes." The older gentleman, watching this exchange, nodded approvingly, sensing a change in Lisa's attitude. He then revealed something that surprised everyone within earshot. "You know, I'm not just a regular passenger either," he said, offering a kind smile to James and Lisa. "My name is Charles Mason. I've spent over 30 years working with veterans, helping soldiers like James transition back to civilian life." Gasps of recognition spread through the nearby seats. Charles Mason was a respected figure, known for his advocacy for veterans' rights and his work in supporting those who had served. Lisa's eyes widened, feeling both humbled and embarrassed by her earlier behavior. She looked at James, feeling an overwhelming respect for him and a deep gratitude for Charles's wisdom. The flight attendant approached again, noticing the respectful silence that had settled over first class. She smiled knowingly at Charles. "Mr. Mason, it's always a pleasure having you on our flights," she said warmly. With this revelation, the atmosphere on the plane shifted even more. Lisa realized the impact of her assumptions and understood how much she had to learn about respect, humility, and seeing beyond appearances. As the plane prepared to land, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, to look at others with an open mind and a gracious heart, just as Charles had shown through his kindness and as James had displayed through his service. The lesson was clear, and it would stay with her long after the plane touched down. A lesson in humility. As the plane began its descent, a calm settled over the cabin. Lisa sat quietly, reflecting on everything that had happened during the flight. Her thoughts kept circling back to James and the way he had carried himself throughout the journey. She couldn't shake the feeling of guilt mixed with admiration. She leaned over to James, her voice soft and sincere. "I really misjudged you, James. I've learned a lot today about respect, humility, and kindness. I should have never treated you the way I did." James looked at her, his eyes warm and forgiving. "We all have moments like that. The important thing is that we learn from them," he replied, his tone gentle but strong. Lisa nodded, feeling grateful for his understanding. "It's strange," she said thoughtfully. "I spend so much time working with people and thinking I know them, but today showed me how much I still need to grow." Meanwhile, Charles, the wise older man who had been watching the exchange, smiled with satisfaction. He could see the change in Lisa's expression, her posture, and even her tone. He decided to share a final piece of advice. "You know," he began, addressing both Lisa and James, "life has a funny way of teaching us important lessons when we least expect them. Sometimes, it's just a matter of being open to learning from others, even those we might have overlooked at first." Lisa absorbed his words, realizing how true they were. She had judged James based on her own assumptions and nearly missed out on meeting someone truly remarkable. As the plane continued its descent, Charles looked around at the other passengers who had been listening in on their conversation. "If there's one thing I've learned from my years of working with veterans," he continued, "it's that we're often quick to overlook people, to judge them before we really see them. But every person has a story worth hearing if we just take the time to listen." The other passengers nodded, murmuring in agreement. Lisa looked back at James, who nodded, acknowledging Charles's wisdom. When the plane finally touched down, Lisa felt a sense of peace and clarity that she hadn't expected. She knew this experience had changed her in a lasting way, reminding her of the importance of kindness, humility, and looking beyond the surface. As they prepared to disembark, Lisa extended her hand to James. "Thank you for your patience," she said with genuine gratitude. "And thank you for your service." James shook her hand with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Lisa. Safe travels." With a nod, Charles gave them both a knowing smile. As they all exited the plane, each of them carried with them a newfound respect for one another, and a lesson that would remain long after the journey had ended, a farewell with lasting impact. As the passengers exited the plane, Lisa watched James and Charles move ahead, feeling both humbled and grateful. The quiet strength she had witnessed in James, and the wisdom from Charles, had left an unforgettable mark on her. She took a deep breath, feeling like a new chapter of understanding and empathy had just opened in her life. In the terminal, she noticed James greeting a group of soldiers who had come to welcome him home. They cheered and hugged him, their respect for him clear in every smile and handshake. Lisa saw the way they looked up to James, not just as a soldier, but as a leader, someone they trusted and admired. It made her realize how wrong her assumptions had been and how much she had underestimated his story. A few steps away, Charles approached her with a knowing smile. "Life's biggest lessons often come from unexpected places," he said gently. "And sometimes, it's the people we least expect who show us the way." Lisa nodded, smiling gratefully. "Thank you, Charles. You were right. I needed to see beyond my own judgments." He chuckled. "And you did. That's what matters." Before parting, Charles extended his hand to Lisa. "Take this lesson with you and share it with others. The world could use more kindness and understanding." Lisa shook his hand firmly. "I will," she promised. As she turned to leave, she glanced back at James one last time. He looked up, caught her gaze, and offered a small, friendly nod. She waved back, feeling that in that brief exchange, a bridge had been built between them, a bridge of understanding and mutual respect. Walking away, Lisa felt lighter, like a new purpose had awakened within her. The experience on this flight was something she would carry forward, striving to be kinder, more open, and always looking beyond the surface. This journey was over, but its lesson was just beginning. And in her heart, she knew she would never be the same.